to welcome you to today's meeting on Iran's nuclear ambitions in perspective. Today's meeting is co-sponsored within the Center by International Security Studies and the Middle East Program, which is directed by Dr. Haleh Esfandiari. The other co-sponsor of today's meeting is the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which with International Security Studies co-sponsors a monthly series of meetings, the Non-Proliferation Forum. I'd also like to welcome Ambassador Joseph Gildenhorn, the chairman of the Woodrow Wilson Center's board, who has just joined us. We're fortunate to have with us today one of the preeminent experts on Iran's national security policy, Dr. Shahram Chubin, who's spending 3 months here at the Woodrow Wilson Center as a public policy scholar. He's based in Geneva, and his research is focused on nonproliferation, terrorism, and Middle East security issues. He was director of studies at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and he's a specialist in the security problems of the Middle East region. He's been a consultant to the U.S. Department of Defense, RAND Corporation, and the United Nations. He was director of regional security studies at the International Institute for Studies, where I first worked for him. He's a recidivist. He was a resident fellow at the Wilson Center in the 1980s. He's back for another stint. He's also been a fellow at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Chubin's taught at various universities, including the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva and the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He lectures at various military staff colleges, and he's published widely in major journals. Most recently, a piece that he may reference today in the Washington, or not, in the Washington Quarterly, that is in the general fishing license of today's topic. A native of Iran, he now lives in Switzerland. It's a pleasure to welcome Shahram Chubin back to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And before I turn the floor over to him, I would just mention that we had a large response to today's meeting, and as a consequence, we have an overflow room upstairs during the question and answer period. We will allow those up in the overflow room to write out questions and shuttle them down here to participate in the meeting in that way. So with that, Shahram, the floor is yours.
It's on. Good, because my voice doesn't carry. First, I want to thank the Wilson Center for inviting me back, or accepting me to come back. And I'd like to thank you for coming out on a day that's supposed to be stormy by Washington standards, and also because the subject, it seems to me, the first question one wants to ask is what? Iran again? Since every day we're hearing about Iran, not to mention the number of op-ed pieces by newly minted experts, and it makes one nostalgic for the old unlamented peer group review system. People seem to be competing to put tiny thoughts often into op-ed pieces, which are subject only to the editorial pages, editors' review acceptance of them. Anyhow, I wanted to cover 7 things, and like a very bad professor, I'm sure I won't be able to do any of them justice. But rather than cover 2 things, I want to cover 7 things. And I'll tell you what they are to start with, in case any of you are interested in any one of them, which I don't cover in enough detail, and you can then push that in the question period. One is, I want to say that the very broad range of opinions about what to do about Iran reflect a very broad range of uncertainties about Iran. Second, I wanted to look at the October offer as to what it tells us about Iranians as chess players as opposed to checkers players. Third, I wanted to say that the nuclear issue, and this is often hard in a place like Washington to emphasize or overemphasize, the nuclear issue is one issue among many between Iran and the U.S. And it's embedded in this legacy of distrust on both sides. The key issue in the nuclear issue is not Iran's capabilities, but suspicions about its intentions, and therefore the distrust that emanates from this broad range of very bad historical interactions in the last 30 years. It poisons the nuclear issue and poisons the discussions about the nuclear issue on both sides, but particularly, I think, on the U.S. side. The fourth point is that Iran has always been divided. This is something people don't realize. Iranian elite has always been divided. Of course, it's much clearer since June, but it's been divided, and I want to make a few references to that telegraphically. The fifth point is what's new about things since June. And the sixth is the Iraqi precedent as a constraint on US policy. That seems to me, sitting in Geneva, an amazing phenomenon when you see the debates going on, how much Iraq has influenced perceptions of what one does about Iran. Finally, what is US policy about? What does it want? It's very unclear to me sometimes what US policy is about. So, we don't know what Iran intends. There's imperfect knowledge. We don't know Iran's capabilities. You just have to follow the discussions, even the official discussions. We don't know what the Iranian capabilities are, whether they're clandestine sites, whether the program is on hold or it's been accelerated, whether there are impurities in the uranium, et cetera, et cetera. We're not even agreed on what a nuclear-capable Iran would entail, what it would mean. And especially, we're not agreed on what to do about it. What is clear is two things. One is, after 7.5 years of negotiations, or 7 years of negotiations, we haven't made much progress in denting the program or in convincing Iran to freeze it. And secondly, there's a very wide range of opinions in response to what to do. And if I were a policymaker here, I would have stopped wearing my hearing aid by now. If you look at the number of op-ed pieces, let me just give a few. One, attack it. I can give you names. Kupperman. Second version of attack it is, let's effect regime change. Because now there's a newfound sympathy for the opponents, the opposition in Iran, Krauthammer and Crystal recently. Do nothing, Roger Cohen. Let things play out, inertia. Whatever you do, don't sanction it. I've got a very nice one from Simon Jenkins where he says, everyone knows sanctions are a path to war. A fourth version is, let's have serious wide-ranging engagement, which has still not been offered allegedly by President Obama. And the Leverets are in that area, Juan Cole, Patrick Seal, and others. What we need to do is reassure Iran, give it regime reassurance, regime security guarantees, and so on. And in exchange, maybe the Iranians will allow us to have more intrusive inspections or freeze. And then we have a fifth version, which is don't engage, because you're dealing with a weakened, delegitimated regime, popular unrest, and popular opposition, and if you engage with them, you're really endorsing them. And there are many suggestions that are predicated on the proposition that the nuclear issue is no longer the most important issue. In some cases, they perhaps never thought it was. And then we have these two simulations, one in Harvard and one in the INSS in Israel, both of which we are told, I wasn't a participant in either, Iran comes out on top, one way or the other. I wonder if that's a prediction or whether it's a look back for the previous 7 years. Now, let me move to the October agreement. I'm not going to talk about the mechanics. You know, or you can find out very easily what was offered, and there's some debate as to whether it was a sensible offer or not. But basically, the idea was to buy time, have Iran ship out its uranium for further enrichment in order to see what could be worked out between the various parties. It was preceded by all those events, the Rome site, the Baradei statement that Iran was on the wrong side of the law. The vote, as you know, was interesting, but I won't go into that. It was 25. The vote in the IAEA condemning Iran was 25 for, 3 against, and 6 abstaining. The 3 and the 6 are interesting. The 3 were Malaysia, Venezuela, and Cuba. The Malaysian, it seems, voted wrongly because the emissary was called back and disavowed. But the six who abstained, Brazil, South Africa, Egypt, and Turkey amongst them, I think are important if one wanted to see if engagement has any chance. Okay, now, after the Iranians more or less pulled back from what seemed an initial agreement, what happened? Basically, the Iranians first announced there would be a firm response to target those who had voted against them. Mr. Larijani said he didn't see any benefit in staying in the NPT, frankly. And he has a point in the sense that if you're in good standing in the NPT, you're entitled to nuclear technology. If you're being denied that technology, then one of the reasons for being in the NPT has gone. The question is whether Iran is in good standing. The The Iranians announced a plan to build a dozen or 10 more enrichment facilities. They threatened to leave the NPT. The oil minister threatens to cut off oil exports. They announced plans to enrich to 20%. They have missile tests of a new missile that goes 2,000 kilometers. They have border clash with Iraq. There's, of course, the hostage taking of US and European nationals who stumbled into the area. They accuse the foreign powers of being behind domestic unrest. And, of course, they continue their savage repression domestically. And, of course, they offer to renegotiate the October deal in very vague terms from the foreign minister, who then proposes his own ultimatum to the West by the end of this month. Now, all of this is from a country that's considered subtle in its diplomacy, that plays chess and has a millennium of classic diplomacy and interaction with the world. Very curious reaction. If you list the things that they've been doing or have happened, I'm not saying they're all direct results of the October, you ask yourself what's going on? Why are the Iranians fabled diplomats not working very effectively? Are they feeling more vulnerable, or is it simply a continuation of 7 years of business as usual? Now, let me just make the second point I wanted to make, which is that the nuclear issue arises very much from the overall relationship. John Limbert recently, I think, was here and said the ghosts of history are always in the room when the Iranians deal with the US. Well, it's a recent history. It's only 30 years. If you want to count Mossadegh too, that's okay, but it's still not a very long history of interaction. And generally, the US has had a good record with Iran. But we know the two narratives, and I don't want to go into them. Basically, the Iranians feel humiliated, frustrated, and angry about Western intervention, British particularly, but also American intervention. They dislike the historical legacy of intervention. They feel manipulated. They don't like the support for the Shah, the Mossadegh, and we have the whole series of things in the last 30 years. The so-called green light to Saddam Hussein, the failure to act in the Security Council, the episode in Vincennes, the non-reaction to chemical weapons use, and so on and so forth. A very series of issues from the Iranian side. And I think the key words there on the Iranian side are humiliation, frustration, and anger. On the American side, it's more outrage and disgust. Outrage and disgust at the hostage-taking particularly, but also, and this is easily forgotten, the events in Lebanon, the attack on the U.S. embassy, the attack on the barracks, later on, other episodes which are cloudy and murky, and it's not clear whether Iran has authorship of them, perhaps Kobar, perhaps even Lockerbie. But in any case, I did mention the Vincennes and the Airbus on the other side. It's a record from the U.S. point of view, and I'm only talking from the U.S. point of view in this talk, of untrustworthy behavior. And what you have is a tendency to see the nuclear issue in terms of Iran's opacity and its malevolence in taking hostages in Lebanon and trying to bargain about it. And it leads you to George W., the last president's comment about Iraq having something to hide. That's a phrase. Saddam was acting as if he had something to hide, because he did have something to hide, that he had nothing. But the same applies to Iran. Iran acts as if it has something to hide. And it leads to the notion that we cannot give them the benefit of the doubt on the nuclear issue, given this legacy of indirection, asymmetric war, whatever you want to call it. But what it is given this distrust, a tendency to assume the worst about what they're doing. And often this deficit in trust, which Baradei used to use the phrase, this lack of confidence, the lack of confidence on both sides, but particularly in the US sees Iran in terms of its behavior as a conspiratorial regime, as an illegitimate regime in some ways, and in which you cannot assume their good intentions. Now, The nuclear issue then has been a subset of the broader issue. I haven't gone into the Europeans and so on. It's quite interesting if you go back, and we need to be refreshed on this. If you go back and think of the behavior of the Europeans, this is not germane to this discussion, with the hostage taking and so on, the Iranian government killed dozens of its opponents abroad, many in Europe, some in Asia, some in Egypt, and so on. There was very little reaction. The reaction on the Western side was really to the officer, Higgins, the other naval officer, I forget his name, Stemple, I think. In any case, specific cases where American nationals were involved, understandably. But as I say, dozens of people were killed by the Iranian regime in state-sponsored terrorism against their opponents, with the Europeans playing along. France particularly played along. Germany to some extent, until it was upended by its court decision in Mykonos. We've had the Argentinian cases as well. My point simply is there's a long history of Iran behaving a certain way and getting away with it, to all intents and purposes. Now, let me go to my fourth point, one that I do cover in the article in the Washington Quarterly and in almost every article I've written on this issue, which is that divisions on the nuclear issue have always existed, but the divisions on the nuclear issue do not go, they're not about whether Iran has a right to nuclear technology. It has to do with the price Iran pays for being obstreperous with the international community and in not undertaking ways to reassure the international community so that it can get its full benefits of the technology. There are differences in that, but that's even a minor issue. The real issue is Iranians have differed inside the country, amongst the elite and in society, about how Iran should evolve and what sort of relationship Iran should have with the world. And the nuclear issue has only been a subset of that issue. I can give you many examples, but let me just give you 3 or 4 examples of major issues on which the elite have disagreed. One was the continuation of the war against Iraq in 1982. There were divisions on that issue. On Iran-Contra, Rafsanjani was so sensitive that he had the people who basically leaked it killed. He could not admit that he was in negotiations with the US. Rafsanjani himself, in the era of Reconstruction, when he was president for 8 years, tried, according to his lights, to open up vis-a-vis the US. But he had real problems in selling his opening up of the economy domestically, because it was stopped by people who wanted a more state-centered economy. In the Khatami era, there are many cases, but the most obvious case is the efforts to, after the CNN interviews, to have some relationship with the US. The US responded through Oman, I believe, and there was never any response from the Khatami period administration, partly because he didn't control that dossier. I don't have to go to other cases, the Karine episode, and other cases where the cooperation, every time we hear about Iran being put on the axis of evil, we're not reminded as to why that happened. It happened because of Karine. Now, you either think the Israelis concocted it, or you believe that the Revolutionary Guards were undermining Khatami's attempt to improve relations with Israel and the West. I believe in the second one, but you can choose. There's a definite attempt to undermine his opening to the West, and so on. Even the period 2003 to 2005, when Iran negotiated with the EU3, which later on, as you know, when the US got involved, became P5+1. With the EU3, it was an attempt by Rouhani and Khatami to reassure the international community. Now, of course, if you go to some centers in Washington, they'll tell you, yes, but at the same time, they were saying that they weren't giving up anything serious, and so on and so forth domestically. Well, that's true. But Rouhani and others were constantly looking over their shoulders at the fact that Mr. Larijani had started already saying that accepting the additional protocol and negotiating and freezing enrichment had been swapping, what was it, a pearl? Yes, I mean, it was been swapping a diamond for a lollipop. And this was in 2004. And in 2004, the Majlis elections, in those Majlis elections, which were not, the latest elections weren't the first elections that were rigged. Those Majlis elections, 150 reformists were banned from running, and some of them had been in parliament before. So the conservatives created a conservative majlis by rigging the elections. And from 2004, the negotiators could do nothing. Rouhani, well, I met the negotiators in 2004 and 5, and they said to me, you know, we've been saved so far by Rouhani's amameh, by his turban, that if he wasn't one of them, we would have been out on our ears already. My point simply is that this, before 2005, when Ahmadinejad came in and said that the nuclear program had no brakes, it was like a train without any brakes, and there was nothing to discuss. Even before that, there was a considerable pressure on the Khatami people not to reassure the international community, to snub the international community. And these divisions, anyhow, picked up. By the time Ahmadinejad came in, he pushed the nationalist chord. He made it a populist issue. Before that, it was an elite issue. And in 2008, Khamenei endorsed what he was doing. And therefore, he was very surprised in 2009 to find all the presidential candidates criticized Ahmadinejad's foreign policy. And some of them had suggestions as to what to do in terms of multinational enrichment or a consortium and so on. Rezai and others had suggestions. My point is the nuclear issue has only been one of consensus on the broad issue that nobody has the right to tell Iran that it has no right to technology on that issue. Apart from that, there have been divisions across the board. And that's only a minor thing. There are divisions as to how Iran should be organized and how it should evolve in terms of its relation to the international community. Obviously, it's been very difficult to criticize Iran's drive for technology within Iran. Nobody in their right mind amongst the elite would say, I disagree with Ahmadinejad, we should give this up because it would be nice in Washington. But the subtext has been, should this be a priority? Should it be exploited for factional ends? Was the price of an inflexible policy worth it? And was this a means of keeping Iran estranged from the international community? And I think that that's more and more clear in the minds of many Iranians. Though the nuclear issue is by no means the issue that people wake up to in the morning. Iranians are worried about far more things. And therefore, there's a misunderstanding when Jackson Deal and other people write editorials that says, the reformists, the Green Movement, have criticized Ahmadinejad's October agreement. So the Iranians are all the same. Well, the Iranians are all the same in the sense that they're not going to be subservient. That's for sure. They're not going to take orders from Washington. In that sense, they're similar. But they're very different in the sense that the Green people want to, well, the Green people want to have a normal relationship with the world and will do what it takes to have a normal relationship with the world. But why they undermined Ahmadinejad's October agreement is very clear. They were paying him back for what he'd done to them. Very simple. Why would they allow him to make an agreement with the West, which they'd been trying to make, which he undermined? It'd be crazy in terms of factional politics. Now, I don't want to talk too much about this because it is in some ways the most interesting and the most difficult issue, which is what are the impact of recent events? I'll just simply raise a number of questions because that might be a shortcut for getting into it later on if you want. One is the regime now unable to make decisions? Second, has the regime changed its objectives? In other words, does it want now a weapon as opposed to a capability? Does it have, if you like, more incentives to have nuclear weapons? Is the regime now more monolithic and less subtle, and also less incoherent and more determined? In the past, there was always this myth of a consensus. There were different groups tugging, and policy often went one way, then another. So there was a certain incoherence that people noticed already in the 90s. With the marginalization of the other elite, you now have a fairly monolithic group of people in power. Does this mean they're going to be more determined and more coherent? Or is the regime more distracted and less able to focus on international affairs while it focuses on preserving the system? Is the regime more vulnerable to sanctions and pressure as a result of all this? Or is it less sensitive to international public opinion? In becoming weakened, will it become more or less aggressive? What we do know is that the elite divisions that I've mentioned have now become pronounced in society. Let me just say one thing about this. Whatever your view as to who won the election, there's no disagreement by either side that 1/3 of the populace supports, at least 1/3 of the populace supports Ahmadinejad and the system. Now, the disagreement is whether 2/3 support him or 1/3. But 1/3 of 70-odd million is a lot of people. And that means that anybody who's running the country has to take into account the very, very different requirements to run the country when you don't just have people who are westernized and oriented toward the economy as opposed to, let's say, social justice or Islamic social mores or whatever. So, but clearly, the elite divisions are more pronounced. The opposition, if you like, the loyal opposition has become radicalized. The regime is now surviving on power and not on legitimacy. And for the opposition, while it's not organized, it's also not clear whether there are not limits to the value of nonviolence. I'm not sure that nonviolence is something that's going to lead to anything other than just more bloody heads and more imprisonment. Okay, now I want to get to the 6th and then 7th point. I only have 4 or 5 minutes. As I said, cannot time myself. Now, the Iraqi thing is really quite amazing, it seems to me. If you think of what Iraq has done as a constraint on U.S. policy, this last section is on U.S. policy, which I wanted to avoid, but since we're in Washington, I suppose I have to get my 2 cents in. The way the subject of Iran has been framed and discussed, and the way policy has been implemented, appears to many to have lessons for current policy toward Iran. The allegations are similar, that Iran has ambitions for weapons of mass destruction, it has facilities, sometimes sotto voce we talk about link to terrorists. Clearly there's a distrust of the regime, its evasive diplomacy, its duplicitous and mendacious behavior, and as I say, acting as if it has something to hide. The other side of it is we also have the unacceptability of the 1% solution. That is, the unacceptability of dealing with a problem which has a low probability but a high consequence effect. The Cheney formula, most people think that that was the wrong formula, or lots of people do, and that we can't repeat it in the Iranian case. And we do that by denying its high consequence. We say, we can live with it. Iran is rational. Deterrence works. It worked against the Chinese. It worked against... So basically, it's a refusal to allow yourself to move into the Iraqi sort of matrix where you get into this 1% syndrome. We don't know what will happen, but it'll be terribly bad, so we should deal with it now. We can live with it. It can be contained. Often this transmutes into the notion that Iran, in any case, Iran's quest for a strategic deterrent is understandable. It's surrounded by nuclear weapon states. It lives in a dangerous neighborhood. I would do the same. I've heard that from so many people in the West that, and in Europe. Well, it's perfectly understandable. I mean, it's Russia in the north, Pakistan, India the other side, and Israel over there. I mean, and then there's the equality norm. Oh, no, then there's the what about Israel? While we're talking about Iran, it's what about Israel? Or the other one, which is Pakistan is a greater threat. It's quite possible that we should be concerned about the Israeli nuclear weapon and Pakistan breaking up and a nuclear threat. But that doesn't mean we don't have to deal with Iran, it seems to me. Then there's the equality norm, which is, well, you know, Iran may have violated or be non-compliant with certain aspects of the NPT, but we didn't treat South Korea or Egypt this way. So what's the problem? And also the definitions of the smoking gun or definitive proof has become more difficult. The bar has been raised since Iraq. We distrust intelligence, maybe understandably. We don't even know what a timely warning would constitute in the case of Iran. And how close do they have to be before we're worried about breakout? In the intelligence community's own goal of the NIE of 2007, undermining sanctions, and it was a declaration of independence of their independence by the intelligence community, but it also was not very helpful. And it's also understandable. First, the intelligence community underestimated Saddam's nuclear capability in 1990. Then they compensated, if you like, by overestimating its nuclear capability, Iraq's nuclear capability in 2002, 2003, slam dunk and all the rest of it. And then we had in Britain the same thing. We had these dodgy dossiers, 45 minutes to make a WMD operational. And then you have this phenomenon of intelligence groupthink, where one country exchanges intelligence with another country, and that second country will talk to a third country without saying where it came from. And that third country will come back to the first country and report something that the first country originated without them saying that it came from the second country. So what you have is a sort of circular reinforcement of dubious intelligence or unverified intelligence, if that's such a word. Then we have the fact that we shouldn't have sanctions because they will lead inexorably to war. You read this, you hear this all the time. Not that sanctions are a substitute, but last time we started with a few UN resolutions, and look what happened. The UN resolutions were a precursor to war, and in a way that's what Russia and China are arguing. Let's have no more. Let's not even talk about another resolution because that will give a certain legitimacy to the war. The sanctions are seen as, in the Iraqi case, as hurting the people, not the regime, and also as a road to war. And of course, the military option is denigrated, partly because threats of military force intimidate American. I won't say the American public because the polls suggest the American public is not yet intimidated, but American comments, particularly Bush comments about things being on the table and people going further with that, intimidates US elites more than it impresses the Iranians. And that's a very strange position to be in, where your coercive diplomacy is negated by your domestic politics, if you like. And of course, military strikes are seen as leading to open-ended land war. What do you do afterwards? What do you do the day after? All of these, I think, are legacies of Iraq. Some of them are good legacies, some of them are not so good. But this does leave the US with very few instruments. Sanctions and military force are criticized. Iran resists engagement. It takes two to engage. The definition of what Iran has to do to be in breach of its commitments is stretched. And selling the Iranian threat is difficult, given that meaningful responses are unattractive, if not discredited by the Iraqi precedent. So I'm over time. Let me just make a couple of comments about US policy. I don't want to bite into discussion. It's not clear to me, frankly, what US policy is. Robert Gates has frequently said, or he's frequently reported, maybe he said it once, said that the military option isn't very attractive vis-a-vis Iran because it would only buy 2 or 3 years. Well, 2 or 3 years is quite a lot. And I'm not promoting the option, but I'm just wondering, what was the October initiative by the US if it wasn't an initiative to buy time? And what are you buying time for exactly? A spontaneous collapse of the regime, or a sudden bolt of lightning that makes the Iranians change their minds about the program? It seems to me that there are at least 3 things that one wants about Iran. One is reassurance about its nuclear objectives. And since there is distrust, the reassurance about its objectives is focused on its capabilities. And that means intrusive inspections. How intrusive would be acceptable to them, we haven't seen, since they don't accept the additional protocol anymore, but they did have it for a while. Secondly, we want a moderation of Iran's regional policies. I've never believed that a technical fix on the nuclear program is enough. it's not enough for the simple reason that there are other things about the regime that we don't like. And what one needs to do is to try and deal with all of them at once. One has to deal with them all at once because the Iranians believe compromise in any one area leads to a slippery slope of further pressure and for compromise in other areas. And they feel, I think, their overall, if they were willing to get into a situation, it would be to negotiate about everything, to use whatever leverage they think they have in Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere in the Gulf, nuisance value in those cases, to get an overall agreement. And the third is, of course, a more democratic, humane, and responsible government. Now, nobody would push that third one very far because that is an issue that no U.S. government has pushed vis-a-vis any of its allies in the region. But by and large, when you have open repression of large numbers of people, it makes it difficult for the United States to engage very far. Now, let me just give you a few examples of what we do have. On the North Korean case, we have a focus on the nuclear issue, as far as I can see. And I'm waiting for Rob for his intervention where I get it wrong, because he's worked on this comparative rogues behavior and policy responses for some time, and in a couple of volumes so far. So North Korea is a focus on the nuclear issue. Libya was sort of WMD plus. It was sort of, you forego WMD and you start behaving in the region. Discounting the attempt to kill the Saudi prince or whoever it was. Basically, we don't worry about what Libya is doing domestically, but it's regional and it's weapons of mass destruction ambitions. The third one is, of course, regime change, like in Iraq. You just simply get rid of the regime, make it impossible for the successor regime for some time to carry on doing what its predecessor was doing. The fourth one, and this is, I just throw it in, it's not really US policy, is what happened and has happened in some countries, which is you have either a regime change, not in the sense, a government change, or you have a societal change, like in South Africa, where you had a renunciation of nuclear weapons, actually by the preceding government, before they handed over to the post-apartheid regime. And Ethel Solingen has done a lot of work on this. Last points, really, last 2 points. One is that delaying and freezing the program and getting the government to reverse or announce its program really are you have the same instruments to deal with both. In other words, there's no real separation. You have basically an attempt to change policy, and what you do is you use sanctions and you use attempts to isolate them, and you sabotage the program. You try and impose costs on the program. You try and induce them to change by giving them incentives. Really, in other words, to either convince them to stop or to delay the program or to reverse, they're more or less the same sets of instruments as far as I can see. I can't see much difference between the two. The third one, of course, is to accept it as likely, if not inevitable, and that's to deal with the set of issues the US government is beginning to do, but very carefully, gingerly, because of what the GCC and Israel think, which is to try and set up policies to contain or to balance and to deter, to throw out a security umbrella, to neutralize the capability should it become manifest. But it raises a number of questions. Is a change in Iran's nuclear policy likely without regime change? The current political turmoil is not the cause of its rejection of engagement. Will targeted sanctions work in isolating miscreants from society, or will they backfire? Is engaging the regime giving it political space and time to crush its domestic opponents? And what is the balance between encouraging change and internal interference? The Cohen says don't do anything. Krauthammer and Crystal say embrace the opponents. Jackson Deal says there's no difference amongst them. My last comment is the nuclear clock ticking faster than domestic change? I don't know. We've had so much hype about Iran's nuclear progress that it's very hard to know. There is change in Iran. It happened suddenly, domestically. It may go further. Is the nuclear clock, is the capacity to master enrichment going much faster than that. The US government's dilemma, of course, is the perceived urgency of the nuclear issue suggests to try and get a deal with a regime which, from the record, is unlikely to offer any concessions regarding international concerns. So what's the alternative? Well, I'm sorry to have dragged you out in the snow here, but I don't have one, except to point out that there is visible now in Iran a broad swathe of society which are the US's natural allies, albeit independent and the opposite of subservient. In them resides the best hope for an Iran that is more pluralistic with an accountable government. Such an Iran is more likely to accept a freeze on the program, which is limited, to build confidence, and offer a more transparent Iran willing to accept intrusive international inspections in exchange for technology transfers, and will offer to reassure the international community about its objectives and be more responsible in the use of sensitive technology. Ironically, in the light of efforts since Iraq to separate dealing with WMD from regime change, the Iranian experience to date has brought us back full circle, where the two, that is, stopping nuclear proliferation and regime change, are intimately linked. Thank you very much.
We'll open it up now for comments and questions from the floor. Could speakers please identify themselves and try to be brief? We'll try to take as many questions as we can. Start with Stanley Kober in the center, and then the gentleman behind him. Did you want to collect some questions, or to have do them in sequence?
Whichever.
Well, let's start it this way, and then we'll see how it goes. Stanley, you're up.
Stanley Kober, the Cato Institute. What do you think would be the political impact of a military attack on Iran, especially on the opposition? How would the opposition react?
Well, I'm humbled because there's so much discussion of this on Gulf 2000 and elsewhere that I feel there's nothing I can really add. I don't know. My guess has always been that it's complicated. I think that the regime, I think most Iranians will rally around in defense of a country that, when the country is attacked. I think that. But I think what the regime has been doing recently, and a lot of its policies are bluff. If you go through it mechanically, you know, as to, okay, you've done this, this attack, what do they do? And then what do you do? And then what do? They will come out extremely badly, assuming the US is not constantly missing its targets and so on. And the regime isn't so stupid as not to figure out who has escalation dominance and where they will end up with very little infrastructure, with certainly no revolutionary guards or missile sites and so on. And at the end of it, the regime will be blamed by the Iranians, in my view, at the end of that cycle. But who knows? So I don't know. I think it's probably better not to get into this. But it's definitely not a good idea to take it off the table. Unfortunately, the US has agonized over this so much in terms of public discussion and official comments that, in effect, the military thing is off the table. I don't think the Iranians believe in it. And they may be wrong. They may be misjudging the Israeli tolerance and the Israeli red lines.
Let me just, before taking the next question, let me interject a question from the overflow room upstairs, because I think it follows on from Stanley's question. The Secretary of State has talked about, I'm just paraphrasing this question, moving towards crippling sanctions. And you referenced sort of one line of thinking that sanctions could lead to war, sanctions would punish the people. What would, quote unquote, smart sanctions, and if we do move that forward, and positing that, you know, you could get the Russians and Chinese to go forward, you know, there's been talk about targeting the Revolutionary Guards, where their money is, et cetera. Is there such a thing as smart sanctions in this context that could get some leverage for us, the international community, on the nuclear question?
Well, first of all, what are sanctions for? They were once thought to encourage discussion amongst the elite about the course adopted by the government. That is to say, this is not the way to go, this is costing us a lot. Well, if that elite has been marginalized and you've got a hardline group in power, monolithic group in power, they're not likely to have that debate. So you're not going to encourage debate amongst the elite. The question is, what else can sanctions do? Sanctions, I'm sure that lots of people in this room, but certainly in this town, know from experience that this discussion about, that they can't do anything is nonsense. They can impose a cost on the program. That doesn't mean that they'll change the program, but they may delay the program. It'll raise the cost, the incremental cost of every piece of technology that they sneak in from third parties. The sabotage of sanctions are not sabotage, but the sorts of things you can do to hurt the program are there. Then the idea that somehow, you either talk to them or you bomb them, or you only talk to them and you don't even threaten to bomb them because that'll upset them, and don't talk about sanctions. I think that the following. I think that there are two levels here. One is US, EU. If you can get the EU talks a strong game, but it's often difficult to get the Germans to do things, even though the Chancellor herself is willing, because there's a serious trade there. Say Japan, South Korea, Australia, like-minded countries, can do a lot in imposing sanctions outside the UN. Okay, but the attractiveness of UN sanctions is not their depth, it's their width. That is, you're sending a signal to Iran that the Security Council, under Chapter 7, deems what you are doing as wrong. And not only that, these two countries that you think you're playing footsies with are supporting this. Now, it doesn't really matter what's in the resolution, as long as you get that resolution, in my view, because it sends a signal, political signal. At the same time, the US's bilateral stuff with Levy and the Treasury and making banks all the stuff they're doing is fine too. I think that's working and it's hurting them. I think as the Revolutionary Guards have gotten more into the economy, into a wider swathe of the economy, there are more targets to hit by sanctions. And I think that some of these will not be associated with public discontent. I think the public will say, well, too bad about these characters having a hard time, filling their pockets, basically. So I would say that sanctions are not a panacea, but sanctions, I've always felt sanctions are the only thing you have between sending an angry letter to the New York Times about what the Iranians are doing and attacking them. If somebody can explain to me what you have in between those two to show your dislike of what they're doing. Don't forget, it's not just a question of Iran. If you believe countries like Iran, like North Korea, like Iraq in the past, or Libya, are contravening their obligations under the NPT, if you lie back and simply say, here are some inducements to change your behavior, but we're not going to do anything to punish you, then the whole question of what is, after, what was it, Fred Ickley's article? After...
About what?
Yeah, after discovery, whatever. Basically, what do you do about enforcement? There is no enforcement mechanism for the NPT. It's supposed to be the Security Council. If a Security Council does not respond to non-compliant, and you get as close to it as you can. When Baradei says Iran is on the wrong side of the law, that's as much as you're going to get from that Egyptian presidential contender. He's not going to say Iran is totally uncompliant. His view of compliance is, non-compliance is evidence of diversion to a weapon. That's his version of non-compliance with the treaty. Non-compliance with safeguards is technically not the same thing. So what I'm saying simply is the Security Council has to take positions. And if it doesn't, then the US has to, for the credibility of the treaty. And it is the most universal treaty. It's still an important, very important treaty. If the US just folds its arms and says, so I think the regime is more vulnerable to sanctions than it was. They have to be carefully targeted. They shouldn't. I don't think the petroleum thing is a particularly good idea. Mm-hmm. But I think that this administration has moved very carefully in trying to find things that would be targeted. Mm-hmm. And I think they can make it work. Make it work in the sense of imposing costs, not changing their decision.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Identify yourself.
My name is Duran Zimmerman. I'm with the resident faculty at National Defense University. We often hear quite a lot about the opaqueness of the two-tiered system of government in Iran and who makes decisions, who calls the shots when, under what sort of circumstances. But it appears to me that the other side of the sort of threat scenario is equally important. And I think you alluded to it when you said, what is Israel's tolerance for a nascent Iranian nuclear power? And I think that we are misreading the Israeli security establishment, because my impression is that they're quite desperate at this stage that something be done. So how much time do you think we have?
You know, again, the same thing. It's daily reading, and you have the views on every side on this. How much time? I have no idea how much time. A lot depends on the nuclear clock. I mean, is Iran really? Is the are the impurities in the centrifuges, are the problems they have in mastering the technology such as to give us more time, or are they pretending? And do they have other sites with P2, P2.5, so other types of technology we don't know about? We just don't know. I mean, my view is that 2006 and with Hezbollah and 2008 with Hamas were both, in a way, wars conducted under the shadow of Iran's nuclear capability. Israel trying to send a message that it could deter and it would respond massively if it was attacked. And the way it would be attacked is exactly the way those two scenarios evolve, which is, you know, missiles coming into Lebanon from those two countries, possibly from Iran as well. But in any case, I think that I don't know if that's been read in Tehran as a warning. Look, watch out. You know, when the Nasrallah says that I wouldn't have started this if I knew how the Israelis would respond. Whether the Iranians realize that the Israelis are on a hair trigger, or they convince themselves that, one, the West is in decline, and two, Israel is losing in the region. And in many ways, Israel is losing in the region. I mean, it's not incorrect. Israel's own mistakes and dare I say it, stubbornness on the question of Palestine has created a lot of belief that Iran can get a lot of mileage in the region. But, you know, even before Ahmadinejad and all this, if you look in the 90s, when Iran was developing missiles, Israel was always the excuse. And it would say things like, we're developing these missiles not for anybody in the region, but for, you know, people outside, just a little bit across the region there. So this was to reassure Saudi and Iraq and others that these missiles weren't intended for the Arabs, they were intended for Israel. So it's always been the rationale. It's always served a domestic regional purpose. And now, since Ahmadinejad in 2005 and Iran's more investment in Hezbollah and the rejectionist front, Khamenei has really liked this a lot and supported it, because Khamenei's name is now competing with Nasrallah and other people's names, and Egypt is sort of a non-factor in the region. So I don't know if they're so besotted by their regional role that they won't read the practical limitations to it when it comes to what Israel will tolerate. Maybe they think Israel is so used to getting missiles landing on their soil that their capability to do it won't change anything. But obviously one of the things they clearly need to do is to get into some sort of informal strategic dialogue with Israel itself, not with the US and not with anyone else, so that they understand each other more clearly. And this was sort of starting under Khatami. Sort of. I mean, in track 2s and track 2.5s. But of course, it's not going anywhere now.
We've been lucky, or there have been tacit red lines, you think?
I think the Iranians are very cautious. I don't think the Iranian regime has ever overestimated its military power. But having said that, they're very given to rhetoric and ideological views, which may, if you like, contaminate their assessment of the world. They may not even know it, but they're the only ones who believe their ideology. They talk about martyr cultures and, you know, the rejectionist model, the Hezbollah model, and, you know, depicting 2006 as a victory, for example. Well, it's a Pyrrhic victory. I mean, they fought, they imposed costs on Israel, but they lost a lot of infrastructure and people. Was that a victory? Or if you believe that, then you might say that an asymmetrical, paying higher costs in an exchange with Israel is worth it.
Yes, sir.
Henry Precht.
Hi, Henry.
Okay. Back in 2003, the Iranians were willing to talk about anything with us. We didn't want to do that, though. There are areas still where we have common ground. In Iraq, I think, in Afghanistan, perhaps in regional security arrangements. Is there any chance that Israel would permit us to go into another room and talk about those subjects for a change, or in addition to the nuclear problem?
I should say that Henry was, when I went back to Iran in 1974, in the U.S. Embassy, and we used to chat a lot and see each other. I hope I've developed a little bit since then. You won't think of me still as this brash person who was only interested in strategic studies. But Henry was later on at the Iran desk, and I've always followed your comments. I agree with you. I think that objectively, Iran and the US agree on virtually everything to do with Iraq and Afghanistan, except for one thing, which is to say who should have more influence in them, or if you like, the nature of the result. And I say this, and I've always said this, Iran wants let's take Iraq. It wants a national government, not a Shiite imposed government. It wants a national government. It wants a secular government, not a religious one. It wants a non-Arab nationalist government. And it wants an independent state. That is to say, not one that's a puppet of the US, or indeed a puppet of anyone else. It doesn't want to be a puppet of Saudi Arabia, for example. Very much, I think, what the US wants. The distrust is whether the US might use Iraq as a base against Iran. So Afghanistan, the same thing. The Iran was always pushing, when it was supporting the Northern Alliance, a coalition of all the ethnic and tribal elements, not just the northern ones, necessarily including the Pashtuns and so on. And there's very much US interest. The only question there again is with NATO there, will that become a stepping stone to pressure on Iran? And so what they've done, really, it's typical Middle Eastern, I think, really, or typically Iranian, which is to leverage instability there as a way of telling you we can create problems, even though the logical result of that would be to destabilize two countries that would hurt Iran much more than you. I mean, the US can leave Iraq and say, look, we've done it. Thank you very much. Who gets hurt? Iran would be in a confrontation with the Sunni states if it supported the Shiites in Iraq. At worst, the thing would implode, and the Shiites would come over the border, and Iran would have to take care of them again, and so on as well. Afghanistan, exactly the same thing. We had over 2 million refugees from Afghanistan in Iran who were treated reasonably well in the 80s and 90s. If that country doesn't somehow pull itself together with the help of NATO, who's going to get hurt? First of all, Iran. I mean, I think first, Iran, even more than Pakistan or anyone else. So I think those are entry points for discussion. And I think that they were starting when Zarif was there and Khatami was there. Now, in 2003, what happened, I think, is the following. As you know, the Iranians were really scared that they'd be next. I remember Rezai in the middle of 2002 said, we're going to be next. And this was way before the discussion in the US. You then saw a series of op-eds by people like Cheney and others and speeches that suggested Iran indeed was next. That in the before the attack on Iraq, the Iranians could see the attack on Iraq was coming, and they said we will be next afterwards, and therefore they predicted it correctly much before many people in Europe did, because they could see it. And after that, they were very sure that their rapid victory would be translated by pressure onto them. You remember the mood in Washington at the time. So they wanted across-the-board discussions. And what seems to have happened is the following: that as a result of the dialogue was going on, as a result of the fact that some Al-Qaeda elements were in Iran, and the intercepts by the NSA of phone calls from Iran to Riyadh, I think it was, maybe it was Jeddah, to Riyadh, I think, signaling attacks on, ordering attacks on Saudi targets. Now, those intercepts were coming from Iran, whether it was Al-Qaeda people with portable telephones or Iranians in the same room with them, we don't know. But what we do know is that President Bush at that time decided there was nothing to talk about. I was writing something at the time when I came here in September, and I talked to Bob Blackwell, who was then at the White House dealing with these issues. He said, look, the president says that I will not talk to people who host people who've killed American civilians. There's an emotional response that, you know, I don't know whether they know it or they commanded it or whatever, but these people are hosting Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has killed 3,000 Americans. I'm not going to talk with them. There's nothing to talk about, particularly in the mood that, you know, we have other options. So that's what I think happened, and that's what I understand happened. And I think the Iranians were, Rafsanjani was willing to talk about everything. And it showed you the mentality, because that thing said basically, you know, Hamas, Hezbollah, all this stuff is, you know, it's peripheral. Let's make a deal. And ever since then, the U.S. has been trying to get back to that position, in a sense, of leverage, so that you could, in a sense, dictate the terms of a broad engagement.
We're going to take 3 more questions and then adjourn. Vikakov, the officer there, and then the gentleman on this side. We'll take those 3, and then why don't we take them together, and then we'll give you a final opportunity, Shahram.
I want to ask you a very speculative question. Maybe it's impossible to answer, but let's suppose Iran goes ahead and builds nuclear weapons. Is there any possibility that it might see some advantage in retaining a degree of uncertainty about whether or not it really has them and choose not to test?
Which is easier with the uranium route, I guess. And then Mona, the gentleman there.
I'm Steve Lambert. I work for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's Strategic Studies Group. I listened to Vali Nasser at Fletcher for a year talk about the Iranian-Prussian moment and kind of geostrategically draw this picture of competition between a Pakistan-Saudi arc and an Iranian-Syrian arc. And you've kind of alluded to geostrategic competition, or at least regional interest that Iran may have, but I wonder if you might comment on that description, please.
You just pass it across the table to the gentleman there, and we'll cap it there. So go ahead, please.
Hugh McElrath, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I heard you say in passing that you didn't think the petroleum thing was a good idea. I'm not sure I caught what the reference was to. But it does raise, you know, what is the utility of sanctions that do not encompass such a huge trade? Is it because the West is too dependent on the Iranian oil?
The last word, Shahram.
Well, let me start with the last one. I can refer you to lots of sources on this if you like. But basically, what I understand is that, you know, Iranian oil is heavily subsidized. Okay? Oil. It's dependent for, I don't know how many percent, but a very significant percent of its refined products on imports, because it doesn't have enough refining capacity, though it's building it. The idea is to hit or inhibit those imports of refined products. Now, the Iranian regime has been trying to get away from these subsidies, these huge subsidies, which are costing it billions of dollars, by increasing domestic prices. It did this a few years ago. I'm not talking about refined, I'm just talking about ordinary oil. But the same thing applies with refined. If you make it harder for them to get refined products in, you make it scarcer, the price will go up, and the regime can then try and keep that as a permanent factor, the reduced consumption, a permanent factor, and blame the West. So you'd be helping them out, basically. You'd be helping the regime out to do what it wants to do anyhow, and what it's trying to do slowly. So I don't see, from what I can understand from reading what people who are specialists say, that this is the most sensible way to go, though it was the most obvious target. pre-Obama, or just as President Obama came in, people were talking about this as the logical thing. But I think that I'm not sure that it is. That's really what I was saying. No, I'm not that concerned. You know, the Iranians periodically say that they will block the Straits of Hormuz as a response to any perceived attack from anybody. Well, that's usually sort of suicidal comment. It's not easy to block the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians would get hurt first, or at least second, and it's one of those bluffs. And I've never believed that, if you remember, when the price of oil was $150 or whatever it was, and it's now down to 50, you know, there might be a temporary jump, but it would come back fairly quickly. I've never thought that that's an inhibiting factor. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think politically it doesn't make a lot of sense. Iran, Syria, and Saudi, Pakistan, geostrategic moment, and so on. I don't know, when I get to the Middle East, I often drop my geopolitical thinking. I don't know why. You know, Iran has been close to Israel. I mean, Iran has been close to Syria since the Iran-Iraq war. Despite what people say about Syria being Alawi and therefore Shiite, I don't think that has anything to do with the relationship. It's one of convenience for both. And it's worked out a long time. It's gone through more than a generation now. Having said that, Syria, I think at any time, if it had enough incentives and pressures, would ditch the Iranian alliance or weaken the alliance, but it'd have to be a lot, because it's the only alliance it has, basically. Syria has nobody else.
There's been a lot of discussion about peeling Syria off.
Yes, and as you can see, what they've done is they've engaged without giving up anything, because it's Hezbollah as well. But Iran's competition with Saudi is very clear, and that's been going on since the revolution. Pakistan is part of it. Sometimes people say if Iran develops a nuclear capability, there will be a cascade of proliferation, and Saudi Arabia will buy or have nuclear weapons stationed on its soil from Pakistan. Well, I think that's if it were to put nuclear weapons into Saudi, Iran with India. That already started under the Shah, but it's developing now with naval exercises and so on, a reasonably friendly relationship with India. Iran is not happy with what Pakistan supports in Afghanistan at all. It doesn't think Afghanistan should be strategic depth for Pakistan. It wants Afghanistan as a stable entity and not a push to vassal state. So there are lots of different elements here, and the nuclear element comes into it, and so does the Shiite element. But I think Iran is basically, its regional policies have been a way of validating itself domestically. And though you often hear at Brookings and elsewhere, in the conference in July and other, that Iran has a sense of itself as having been a former great power, imperial power, and its natural role is to dominate the region, I think that's utter nonsense. I think it's utter nonsense. Iran has always been more or less an isolated state in modern times. It's not an Arab state. It's not a nation state. It has no constituency anywhere. It's tried through the non-aligned in the last 30 years. It really doesn't have any... and anyhow, if that were true, how does that jibe with the narrative we have of Iran having been oppressed by everybody? I'm sorry. I mean, apologists for Iran say Iran has never invaded anybody. It hasn't been at war with anybody. It's been interfered with and messed about with by others. That doesn't jibe with the notion that he feels its natural position as the dominant power in the region, whatever the region is. I think in general it feels that it should have paramount influence in the Gulf. That doesn't mean well, it depends which regime you're dealing with, but that means basically to have a big say in the region. And under these people, it means no U.S. presence. Under the Shah, it meant something somewhat similar, but not quite the same thing. It meant minimum U.S. presence, I'll take care of it. But these people say, I'll take care of it, meaning they'll become like me. The Shah meant, I'll take care of it in the sense that I'll keep things stable. So let me move to the first question. I have never thought, and I'm just waiting for the announcement to disprove this, that the Iranians want nuclear weapons per se. I think they want a capability. All the things against nuclear weapons themselves they're just too long to list. But that's what's implied by your question about testing. Look, this is what you would do. You would first have to be sure that you have enough material and an assured means of delivery and weaponization and delivery to pull out of the treaty. Now, that's to pull out of the treaty, declare that you're North Korea, and be able to live with the fact that you're not going to get any technology from anybody. I mean, look, with the Indians in 1974 exploded a peaceful device, their nuclear energy program really went downhill because they were cut off from any nuclear technology, basically. Now, Iran doesn't. At what point will Iran have enough fissile material and enough confidence to do that? Now, the other part of the question, or it's a slightly different part, may have been, well, they will go as far as they can toward a nuclear weapons capability. They won't assemble the two parts of the nuclear device. They won't test it, but they'll reassure themselves that they have the capability to do it within a short period. That could have been your question. Yes. Okay. So the answer to that is, I think that's much more likely. The only question is what, again, how much fissile material, how many weapons, for you to have confidence in a capacity that might be discovered. But of course, you may not worry about that in the sense that we really don't know what it is that, as I said, the US is trying to stop. Is it a weapons capability or is it weapons? And if it's a weapons capability, well, the famous phrase of timely warning, what is timely warning? Is it 30 days, 50 days, 100 days? Do they have to have, if the thing isn't mounted and they're still technically within the treaty, is that enough? And then the whole point of this distrust is that you want longer period, the more you distrust the party. Obviously, a country like Japan or other countries that might have these disparate capabilities that could be fixed together, you're less worried about. But with a country like Iran, you assume the worst, so therefore you try and keep the maximum distance between whatever capability it has and its being able to operationalize it. But for what it's worth, I don't think Rafsanjani and others, when they started this in 87, 88, they went very slowly, and finally they got the sudden acceleration in 99 when A.Q. Khan's stuff came in. And then 2001, the surprise revelation, they hadn't expected it. They'd been playing a game of bluff and sort of trying to push back against the international community while they keep the program going. I don't think they've actually ever thought, what sort of program, who is it targeted against, what certainty of delivery, is it going to be too azimuth like de Gaulle, or is it going to be aimed at Israel? Or the U.S. You don't need to hit U.S. targets and nearby. You don't need nuclear weapons to hit them. Or is it, the Rumsfeld report in, was it 1999, about are they trying to develop missiles that would hit the continental U.S.? I don't think, they've got so many other problems that the idea of engaging the U.S. on the intercontinental level of nuclear weapons is so far away from either their capability or their thought patterns.
On behalf of Halas Fundiari and Joe Pilot of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, I'd like to thank you all for attending today, and please join me in thanking Shahram Chubin for an excellent presentation.